Welcome back. In the previous video, we created this function calculate crosshair spread, and that takes our velocity and maps it from the walk speed range to a velocity multiplier range, which is 0 to 1. And we take that and use it to affect our crosshair spread multiplier. And we're going to use that crosshair spread multiplier to affect our crosshair spread. So we need to do a couple of things. First, we need to calculate our crosshair spread every frame, which means we need to call this in tick. So let's go down to our tick function and call this function. Let's call calculate crosshair spread, and it takes delta time. So we'll give this a comment and say calculate crosshair spread multiplier. Now we need to access the crosshair spread multiplier, and we need to do so from blueprints in the HUD blueprint. So we're going to need to create a public getter for the crosshair spread multiplier. So let's go all the way down to our public section with the getters in here. And just under get aiming, I'm going to create a function that returns a float called get crosshair spread multiplier. And since this function won't be changing anything, we're going to make it const. Now, I'm not going to make it force inline because this function has to be blueprint callable. So we're going to give it a u function macro and make it blueprint callable. And u functions cannot be inline, so we cannot make it force inline. But we can go ahead and create a body for this, and it's going to simply return crosshair spread multiplier. Let's go ahead and compile. Now back here in the editor, we're going to open up the shooter HUD BP. I'll go ahead and close out of these other classes. And here in shooter HUD BP, we're drawing a crosshairs to the screen using draw texture. But since we want our crosshairs to spread, we're actually going to need to draw 4 textures, one for each arm of the crosshairs. See, the crosshairs have 4 arms, and when we spread, what we're really talking about is drawing each of these arms a little bit farther apart from each other. So we've actually imported in our assets folder in textures and crosshairs, we actually have crosshairs that are single arms. Go ahead and double click on crosshair quad 9 bottom and you'll see what I mean. Use the mouse wheel to scroll up and you'll see that crosshair quad 9 bottom is just the bottom arm of the crosshairs. Same with crosshair quad 9 left. It's just the left arm, and so on. So instead of draw texture, we're going to draw 4 different textures. Now we're also going to need to access the crosshair spread multiplier using that blueprint callable function on the shooter character, which means we're going to need a reference to the shooter character from here in the HUD. So let's add a new variable and let's call this shooter character. And this is going to be of type shooter character BP. So we'll change the type to shooter character BP. Now we need to get this variable, and we'll use begin play for that. So right click and type event begin play, and we'll get event begin play here in the shooter HUD. So the first thing we're going to do is get shooter character, get that node, and we're going to see if it's valid. It shouldn't be because we haven't set it to anything yet, but we're still going to perform the check, and if it's not valid, we're going to set this variable. The way we can get shooter character is we can right click and say get player pawn. Get player pawn is a handy function that can always get you the player pawn, specifically the one with index 0, but in a game like ours where there's only one character, the character always has the index 0. If you hover over get player pawn, you'll see it says target as gameplay statics. That means in C++, it's a uGameplay statics function. So that's good to know. We're going to take the value returned from get player pawn and cast it to shooter character BP. And we'll hook up the is not valid wire from our is valid node to the cast. Once we've cast it to shooter character BP, then we can set shooter character. So we're going to set the shooter character to the value that we got from the cast. So now after begin play, we know that we'll have a reference to shooter character. So I'm going to give this a comment and say, get a reference to shooter character. Now, in event receive draw HUD, we do a few things like get the screen center and then get the crosshairs location, and then we draw texture. Well, I'm going to go ahead and break this line to draw texture, and I'm going to take these and I'm going to move them aside for now. I'm going to move them up here, get them out of the way, because we need to do a few things first. For one, we need to get our crosshair spread multiplier. Let's create a new variable and call this crosshair spread multiplier. This will be a float variable, and we need to set this, and we can get it from the shooter character. Now, before we go and access the shooter character, we're going to check to see if it's valid. I know we already did in begin play, but it's good practice to always check to see if a variable is valid before we try to get it, just like we do in C++. So we're going to get shooter character and use the isValid node. If it's not valid, then we need to use getPlayerPawn and cast its return value to shooter character BP and use the isNotValid wire to hook that up, and then finally take the result of the cast and set shooter character to that value. So once we know that we have a valid shooter character, then we can get our shooter character and call the blueprint callable function get crosshair spread multiplier. And once we have that value, we can set our variable called crosshair spread multiplier with the return value from this function call. Now we'll take the output pin from isValid in our shooter character and hook that up here. But we'll also take the output pin of our setter after we did the cast and set shooter character in the not valid case. We'll still hook that up here. So whichever case, we'll still set crosshair spread multiplier. Now that we have our crosshair spread multiplier, we're ready to actually draw the crosshairs. And again, we need to draw 4 different crosshairs. Now, because this is starting to get a little unwieldy, we're going to want to do a few comments here. So here where we're setting the screen center and crosshair location, I'm going to wrap these in a comment. I'll say set screen center and crosshair location. And then here we're getting the shooter character and making sure it's valid. So I'm going to comment this and say make sure shooter character is valid. Next, I'm going to comment these and say get crosshair spread multiplier. Now we know exactly what we're doing. Now the crosshair spread multiplier is only going to have a value of about 0.5 to 1.5 depending on our velocity. So let's go ahead and create another float variable called crosshair spread max. And we're going to use that to multiply our crosshair spread multiplier just in case it's not big enough to affect our crosshairs enough. And we may tweak this value, but I'm going to give it a default value of 16. You give a float variable a default value by first compiling and then in the details panel setting its default value. Okay, so now let's draw the 4 arms of our crosshairs. So I'm going to go ahead and take these nodes that I set aside where I was calling draw texture earlier, and I'm going to hook up the crosshair spread multiplier setter to draw texture. Now, instead of drawing the entire crosshairs, we're just going to draw one of the arms. Remember, we have crosshair quad 9 bottom, left, right, and top. So let's start with the bottom. So we'll take our texture drop down, and I'm going to type bottom. We'll see crosshair quad 9 bottom. That's what we're going to draw. Now it still has the same screen W and screen H. All of these are the same. The only thing that's going to change is our screen X and our screen Y. So far, all we're doing is taking our crosshair location and we're subtracting off the crosshair half width and crosshair half height, and this gives us basically our base crosshair location. We can call that crosshair center. In fact, we can go ahead and put these both in a 2D vector and call that crosshair base center. Let's go ahead and create a new variable and call this crosshair base center, and we'll make this a vector 2D, and we'll set it right here. Set crosshair base center, and we'll set it to these values for x and y. So I can drag off of one of these and type make vector 2D, and it'll be the result of these minus nodes. So let's break those away there, and this will be used to set crosshair base center. And we'll put a comment here, and this will be center of crosshair location. So when we draw the bottom arm of the crosshair, we're going to use crosshair base center, and we're going to break it into the x and y. Now we're going to use the x value for the screen x, and instead of the y, we're going to add our crosshair spread multiplier to the y. So let's use a float plus float node, and we'll use crosshair spread multiplier. And we're going to multiply crosshair spread multiplier by crosshair spread max using a float times float. So crosshair spread max is just going to make our crosshair spread multiplier just a little bit more dramatic, and we can alter crosshair spread max to make the overall spread bigger or smaller. And so we'll use this y for the screen y. Let's go ahead and compile this and see what it looks like on the screen. So there is our bottom arm of the crosshairs, and you'll see that it's being pushed down a bit based on our velocity. Because remember, since we're adding to this, adding to the y coordinate in screen space means going downward, since the y coordinate starts at 0 at the top and goes down to the max at the bottom. And if we change the value of crosshair spread max to say something like 32, and we go ahead and hit play, you'll see that it's being spread much more dramatically. So we can actually change that crosshair spread max to alter the effect of the crosshair spread. So that's drawing the crosshair's bottom arm. Let's go ahead and draw the crosshair top arm as well. So let's take this draw texture and duplicate it. And instead of crosshair quad 9 bottom, let's use the crosshair quad 9 top. And we can take all these nodes here and simply copy them. And we can hook up the X from our crosshair base center to screen X. And instead of adding the crosshair spread multiplier to Y, we can subtract it. So let's get a float minus float. And instead of adding, let's go ahead and subtract our crosshair spread multiplier from it and make sure these are connected to the right inputs. The X should go to the X and the Y should go to the Y. Let's give this a try. And here we have both of our crosshairs, top and bottom. And if we go ahead and run, you'll see that they're spreading away from each other as our velocity increases. So that's working as expected. Now we just need to draw the crosshairs left and right. So we can go ahead and copy these nodes and paste them down here underneath, and we'll connect the output from draw texture to the input to draw texture here. And for this one, we're going to use crosshair quad 9 left. And this time, instead of adding to the Y component of our crosshair base center, we're going to simply hook up the Y straight in. And we're actually going to subtract crosshair spread multiplier from our X. So let's take X and use a float minus float node and subtract off crosshair spread multiplier. And then we'll plug that into the screen X, And I'm going to go ahead and double click on this wire connecting the Y to the screen Y to give it a reroute node. That way we'll have a bit more room here. I like my nodes to be a little bit more organized and orderly. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy these, and I'll remove these nodes for this next draw texture and paste what we had for the previous draw texture. And the only difference is we're going to add to the x coordinate rather than subtract. So let's get a float plus float node, and instead of subtracting, we'll add the crosshair spread multiplier, and then we'll simply plug this into screen X and plug the Y into screen Y. And for the texture, we're going to use crosshair quad 9 right. So we can compile this and hit play, and now we have all 4 crosshairs, and if we start running, we'll see that they start spreading apart. So to recap, we're simply calling draw texture to draw each individual arm of the crosshairs to the screen. And we've got this crosshair base center, which is just the center of the crosshairs that we've calculated here. And we're going to use that, and we're simply adding either to its x or y coordinate some value that is basically the crosshair spread multiplier multiplied by crosshair spread max. Now again, crosshair spread max can be tweaked. Again, I'm going to set this to 32 again, just to show you when we run how it can be spread a lot wider. For example, if we take crosshair spread max and set it to say 120 and then press play, well, now you'll see that the spread is a lot more dramatic. So it's nice to have that parameter there just so we can tweak this and see if we like larger or smaller values. But I'm going to go ahead and keep it at a value of 16 for now. So that takes care of spreading our crosshairs based on our character's velocity. Now we have several other factors that we would like to affect the crosshair spread, and we're going to continue implementing those in the next video. So we'll see you very soon.